In this video, we're going to go through some of the vocabulary that's absolutely fundamental for talking about the topic of urbanization and talking about my city and also my country. And the great thing about this topic is that it's also very good for transitioning into, for leading into talking about tourism. So much of the vocabulary, much of the nouns, much of the areas in the city that we identify, and also some of the issues with urbanization, with some of the issues with living in big cities, we can also use to talk about some of the problems and issues of discussing tourism. So this is really good, and I really recommend memorizing this vocabulary very well because it's useful for so many different part two prompts that we get in the IELTS. So discussing the different areas of the city, and it's also very good for many of the prompts that we get in tourism. So let's get started. So first, let's go through the identifying the areas of the city that we want to be able to talk about. And the first is being identifying if there's a business district in our city. And often in large cities, there's a big business district, there's a big financial district. So for example, in London, the city is actually called the city, is the financial district, the financial area of the city of London, and it's very, very famous. Also in cities, there'll be a shopping district. So that's where many of the shopping malls, department stores, supermarkets, pedestrian shopping streets, street markets are all concentrated. And often they're tourist attractions because that's where people want to visit because they want to buy souvenirs and gifts to take back with them when they return home. In many cities, there used to be industrial areas. So that's where the factories and industrial plants were concentrated. But now, because of the awareness of the issues of air pollution and climate change and global warming, many of these have been moved outside of the cities and often into the suburbs or actually relocated at a much further distance from outside the city. When we refer to the business district and the shopping district together, we might just refer to that as an entirety altogether as a commercial district. Remember, with a city, we want to also identify if we're talking about the city center or the downtown area, as they say in American English, or if we're talking about the suburbs, so that's on the outer skirts, on the outskirts of the city. And often that's where more affluent people, the middle classes, often live because they don't want to live directly in the city center because it's too busy and too polluted. So they'll often move outside of the city. In other cities where there's been a lot of migration into the city and the city cannot cope with that influx of migrants and low-skilled migrants in particular, this has often led to inner city slums, or another term is shanty towns. And this is where the low-skilled immigrant workers, they actually build shelters in order to live. And places like Delhi, Mumbai, and many big cities in South America, they often have slums which have become quite famous for one reason or another. And so that's one negative consequence of urbanization. And what is urbanization? Urbanization is when a urban center, a city, attracts a lot of workers, both unskilled and professionals, to come to the city for job opportunities. And so this is an important topic. This is an important issue in the topic of urbanization and talking about my city because it's often a big problem that many cities face. When talking about city, we want to talk about the local services that the local government provides to its inhabitants, to its local residents. And of course, that one big local service that concerns everyone is talking about healthcare. And in many cities, that will be in the form of hospitals. So regardless of the illness, people will go to the hospital in order to receive treatment from a doctor. The UK, by the way, is a little bit unique in that it has a middle step or a step before the patient goes to the hospital, and that's called something called a general practitioner, and often just referred to as a GP. And people go to the GP first to be diagnosed by a general practitioner. So that's a doctor who doesn't specialize in anything, just has a knowledge in many different things, but often a superficial knowledge in many different areas of medicine. And then they will decide whether the patient then needs to go and see a specialist. And so in the UK, we will go and see the general practitioner first, and then they might refer us to a specialist. So, for example, if I have a sports injury, then they might refer me to a physiotherapist, and then I get an appointment to go and see a physiotherapist about my shoulder injury, for example. But other countries don't have that system, and the UK is quite unique in that. Sports facilities. So if we start talking about the topic area of general health and diet, we want to talk about the sports facilities that the government provides for its inhabitants. And the ones that we want to identify are sports centres. So sports centres will be places where people can play indoor basketball, indoor five-a-side, badminton, squash, gymnastics as well. And often there'll be one large building with different rooms where people can do different sports. Leisure centres are sometimes referred, and leisure centres will be the same thing, but they will also have things like a swimming pool and a gym. And they're very, very popular. Community swimming pools. So that's when we're just talking about a swimming pool where people from that local area can go, and often the cost of going swimming there is subsidized because the government wants to encourage people to use these facilities. And the other interesting one to talk about as well is public parks. Public parks are very important in big cities because people don't have the opportunity to go and experience nature. So they don't have the opportunity to go into nature to just walk among trees and flowers and just be outside of the city. So for people's general well-being and people's mental health, public parks are absolutely crucial. And it's important that the public parks are well maintained and they have facilities like a children's playground, and toilets, public toilets, so that people can go there and spend a long periods of time there. Something that's very interesting about South Asian culture and East Asian culture is public parks are often a big part of city life. And you go there and it's something people do after work. They go and they exercise, they'll jog around, they'll do Tai Chi or other physical exercises. They'll take their children and they'll fly kites. They might have a picnic there. And it's something that's very, very important for local residents, that they have this facility to go and use. The other big local service that the government provides for its local inhabitants, of course, is education. And that's a big concern for parents in particular, because one reason why they might move to a particular city or a particular area within the city is because it has access to local primary schools and secondary schools which are high achieving and which provide good education for students. And in England, we call that the catchment area. So if somebody buys a house or rents a house in a particular area, it will fall within an area that belongs to a certain school. So if you're within that area, within that catchment area, it then means that you have the right to then send your child to that school. What's one knock-on effect of this is that those houses and accommodation in that particular catchment area, they will often be more expensive because they are in the catchment area of high achieving schools. And of course, people are willing to pay a little bit extra in order to send their children to good schools. Other local services to mention are definitely libraries, public libraries. And in the UK, we're very lucky that we have in cities public libraries which are free for local residents to use, and you can go and borrow books free. And sometimes there might be a fine if you return the book late. But it's a great facility, and it's something that's it's very, very important for people, as a place for people to just to go that's outside of their own home, and to have access to reading material which often they might not be able to afford. Other things are community youth clubs. So this is something for teenagers to go after school, and they're very, very important because teenagers often need somewhere in order to socialize and to get informal advice from adults. And one of the negative things that's happened in the UK is a lot of these youth clubs have been closed. And so a lot of young people don't have access to advice, and they don't have access to any kind of leisure activity. And as a consequence of that, they often fall into gang culture. So this is something that governments really need to invest in, because it's so important in keeping the crime rate down and keeping young people safe, and hopefully these young people go into productive lives and not into a life of crime, which of course is very, very negative. Another big part of talking about city life, and also talking about tourism and the reasons why somebody would visit a city or visit a particular area, is talking about the nightlife. And the nightlife includes things like pubs, which is something that we get in the UK, public houses, bars, nightclubs, restaurants, theatres, concert halls, and other things like talking about karaoke bars, which we don't have so much in the UK, but is a big thing in Asian culture. So that's all part of nightlife. So anything that people can do in the evenings to socialize with their friends is nightlife. And some of the verbs that we use for that are verbs like go out. So I might say, oh, I'm going out tonight. And that actually means I'm going out with friends to somewhere to have fun. So it might be a short form of saying I'm actually going to a nightclub with a group of friends. We also say have a night out, and have a night out on the town might mean that we're actually celebrating something. So we go for a night out, we go to a restaurant for a meal, and then we might go on to a pub and then onto a nightclub. And that's to have a night out on the town. We're doing maybe one or two activities, and we're often celebrating something. Just notice that with the nightlife, you can actually, there's a subcategory where if you want to actually specifically refer to cultural venues. So talking about going to the theatre and watching a play, or if you're talking about going to a theatre to watch a theatrical performance. So, for example, if I went to see somebody, a group that has special skills in something, then I might go and watch that. So, for example, if I want to watch acrobatics, so people performing amazing feats on tight ropes, or if I wanted to watch something that's very popular in China is Shaolin monks. So I go and watch them perform some amazing physical feats because of the training that they've undergone in a Shaolin monastery. Another one to mention is talking about major sporting events, and there's actually a part two and part three prompt and part three questions on this. And this relates to talking about tourism, because it's often a tourist attraction. One thing that attracts tourists to come to a city is because this city often, either annually or every 4 years, depending on the sporting event, it hosts this particular sporting event. So, for example, in Formula One motor racing, hosting a Grand Prix is something that many cities do, and they're often around the world, and they host them once a year. So, for example, there's a Grand Prix in Shanghai, there's a Grand Prix in Bahrain, there's a Grand Prix in, it used to be in Brands Hatch in the UK, it's now Silverstone, I think. And so that's one attraction of for local people to go and attend, but also for people to come into the country to attend. Other big ones is football. So the Premiership in the UK is popular worldwide, and it's when people visit England, one thing that they want to do is actually attend a Premiership football match, and they'll go and watch one of their favourite teams, which they've been following back home. What's the benefit of having major sporting events? Of course, it's the tourism pound, the tourism dollar. So generating tax revenue from tourism. Also, it's for the prestige of the country. So it adds to the reputation of the country that they have the capability to host this major sporting event. And if they do it well, then it draws a lot of attention to the country. And then in turn, that will make this country a much more attractive place for tourism, a more attractive tourist destination. The other thing to talk about when talking about cities is the transportation system within the city. And the first two to identify, of course, is the metro system. And you can say metro or underground system, we say in the UK. And we have we have an informal term for that called the tube, because we only have one in the UK, which is actually in London. In American English, they say subway system, and metro system is actually the European term, but it's very common in many Asian countries. Some Asian cities, I've noticed, particularly Bangkok, they don't have an underground. They actually have an elevated subway system. Sorry, I shouldn't say subway. So they have an elevated metro system. So the trains don't go underground; they actually go above, because due to the geography of the city, they're not able to dig underground. So they actually uh, have elevated their mass transport system, so their metro system, and also some of their roads are actually elevated, so they actually go above the city. When talking about the bus service, don't forget to mention the number of bus routes. So is there a comprehensive network of bus routes around the city for people to move around the city easily? On each route, are there frequent buses? So does the passenger have to wait a long time for each bus on each route, or do they come very frequently? So for example, if I'm taking bus route 68 from the center to a district, do I have to wait 20 minutes for a bus, or do they come every 2 minutes, or do they come every 3 minutes? And ideally, in big cities, we want the buses to be very frequent. Also, we want the buses to be in good condition. So they want to be air conditioned with comfortable seating. And preferably, we want them to be electric vehicles. Many cities have already made the transition to electric buses. And that's a great thing, because it really does help improve the air quality of the city. And that's a big, big issue in most major urban centers now, unfortunately. There might be other forms of commuting around the city. And the third one to mention is bike sharing schemes. And these have become very, very popular, particularly in those countries where they have a warm climate, because it's very easy to cycle around the city anyway. And so they've introduced a scheme where you can access a bike by scanning a QR code and then using the bike for a certain period of time, and you're charged a very small fee for that, and then you return the bike to a particular bay or area where the bikes are then concentrated, and then other people can then access the bike. They've become very, very successful because of smartphone technology. So it's now very easy to access them. You download an app, you put credit onto that app, so you put money onto the app, and then you simply scan a QR code and it takes the money from your account, and then you use the bike. And if there's any damage to the bike, then they know who did the damage or who was the last person to have the bike. And so that will then encourage people to treat the bicycles well, to look after the bicycles while they're using them. One of the big problems before smartphone technology was people would use the bikes, they would abuse them, they would damage them, they wouldn't return them to the specific area, and often the bikes were in poor condition and were lost. And so that's why the introduction of smartphone technology has been such a game changer for bike sharing schemes, and that's why they've become much more popular. The other thing to talk about when discussing cities is the infrastructure. Now, infrastructure means the physical parts of the city. In particular, we want to talk about the roads. When we talk about the transportation system, if we're referring to that in terms of its physical structure and not its service, then we can talk about that as well. So I might say, for example, the metro system is in very good condition. It's very modern. The road network is in very good condition. The surface of the roads is very good. The pavements are good. They're very safe to walk on. They're wide. The other things is talking about the buildings. So in the buildings and the tutor mentioned, as we've already said, are healthcare and education. To say that the physical buildings and the classrooms and the hospitals are physically in good condition. And unfortunately, in the UK, we're going through a problem at the moment where many of our schools, the buildings are damaged and dangerous, and due to lack of investment. So the government hasn't maintained these buildings particularly well, and now it's all come to a head. It's all problems are arising all the time with the condition of the buildings, and they're actually endangering the safety of pupils. And so it's a big issue at the moment in the UK. Also, going back to talking about bike sharing schemes, another alternative form of commuting and traveling around the city that governments should be, in my view, should be encouraging local inhabitants to do is to cycle. So they can use the bike sharing schemes, or they can buy their own bicycle. Cycling is becoming more popular because local governments have invested in building cycle lanes and in pavements so that people can cycle around the city much more easily and much more safely. One of the reasons why cycling was very unpopular, particularly with mothers with young children, is because it was very dangerous. Cyclists would often have to cycle in the road with lots of traffic, and much of this traffic were heavy vehicles like buses and lorries. And so not only is it dangerous, but it's also not very healthy, because you're breathing in a lot of the exhaust fumes, a lot of the emissions from these very polluting vehicles. And so many governments have decided, okay, we need to rectify this problem. We need to alleviate this problem and encourage people to cycle, but we need to make it safe for them. So we build separate cycle lanes. And hopefully this is a trend that will continue, because I think cycling has to be part of the future, not only because it's a form of transportation that's not polluting, but it's also very good for people's health. And health is another major issue for people living in big cities, because the lifestyle is often very unhealthy. And let's just quickly look at some verbs for this. So we've got the verb commute and the noun activity, commuting, and then we can paraphrase that by get to work, travel to work, and talk about the rush hour and the peak traveling times that we often commute during. So when we're all going to work at the same time, and we're all leaving work at the same time, and that rush hour, those peak times, often it's not a very pleasant time to travel. If we're talking about parents taking their children to school, so that's also part of commuting. That's also part of the problem with this rush hour. It's not only just people traveling to work, it's parents taking their young children to school. And when they do this, we call that do the school run. So that's take the children to school. And just notice some other verbs that we can use to talk about work. So leave home for work, get to work, don't say get to my work. I often hear students say that. We don't use the possessive pronoun for work. We don't use the possessive pronoun for work, school, university. So we just say I'm at university. I'm not at my university, or I go to my university, or I'm going to university tomorrow. Be late for work, be at work, work long hours, work overtime, work unpaid overtime. So in many cultures, overtime is not paid, and get home from work. Other important terminology. Remember, one thing to do when you're talking, when you've been asked a question on a particular topic, is define the topic or define some of the important terminology for your reader or for your listener. So, for example, when we're talking about urbanization is when the rural population migrate to the urban centers, and that's usually for work and often for education opportunities as well. So when people go to university, they'll be going to a big city because that's where many of the big universities are. And remember, as we said, this is very important. You've got basically two types of migrants. One are the low-skilled migrants from rural areas, and then the other type is professionals. So professionals, remember, are people who've actually got a university degree and have entered into a particular profession. So, for example, being a lawyer, being a teacher, being an engineer, those are professions. And at the other extreme end are the unskilled workers who are doing things like cleaning, being au pairs, being maids. That's a big thing in Hong Kong. Many Filipino women go and be maids, so they actually look after the house, and they cook for the house owner. Being street workers, being construction workers. So those are low skilled and low paid jobs that many people from uneducated people from rural areas are moving to the city in order to do. Or actually, very interesting as well, they're actually going to another country to do, and then they send the money back to their families in the form of remittances. And that's a very interesting topic as well. When this happens, when we get lots of people moving to these areas, what are some of the issues that arise from having a large number of people moving into the city? Of course, there's stress on the local services that we've just mentioned. So the stress on hospitals, the stress on education, the stress on using local services like the libraries, sports facilities, using public transportation. There's now more people wanting to move around the city at peak times. So all of that is putting a stress on the local services. And of course, equally a stress on the local infrastructure. If there's more people traveling by bus and there's more buses running, that's going to cause more traffic congestion. If there's more people traveling using the metro system, that's going to cause overcrowding on the metro system, and that's going to mean that people are often late for work, and then that's going to have an impact on them individually and on the performance of the company. So this is something that local governments need to address. They need to make sure that if they have a lot of migration into their city, can the infrastructure and the local services, can they cope with this increase in volume of the number of people that are in the city? Another issue is when you get lots of people and some of them can't find work and they're unskilled, that might lead to an increase in crime. And that might lead to an increase in organized crime, because gangs then will try and encourage these people who don't have any other opportunities to engage in criminal activity. And so addressing that problem is something that governments need to do. When talking about the type of city, remember that you can identify the capital city, of course, we know. But then if you want to say if it's a top tier city, so if it's if in your country you have a number of very large cities. So for example, in the UK, we don't. We just have London that's big, and then Manchester and Birmingham, which are the next biggest, but they're smaller by quite a large degree. But for example, if you're talking about China, then in China you have the top tier cities, which is Beijing, Tianjin, Shanghai, Guangzhou, and maybe Shenzhen as well, and Chongqing, because they're very, very large. They have massive populations. And then under that, you still have very, very large cities, which are something like 8, 9 million. And then we refer to those as second tier cities. And even because China's got so many cities of so many large sizes, then we can also refer to third tier cities. So that's nice vocabulary to use. When talking about vehicles, remember to mention that one thing the government should be encouraging the population to do is to try and use low emission vehicles. So vehicles that are not polluting, that are not causing, that are not emitting a large amount of emissions, not emitting a lot of exhaust fumes. And we want the population to transition from internal combustion engine vehicles to electric vehicles. That's the trend at the moment. Whether we can actually achieve that, I think that's another issue. But just for the purposes of the IELTS, just say that that's a policy that the government should be pursuing. They should be encouraging drivers to transition from polluting vehicles to electric vehicles because they emit far less. They don't emit any exhaust fumes or emissions, and therefore it's much better for the air quality of the city. And remember, air pollution leads to illness. It leads to people becoming ill with long-term diseases like respiratory problems and lung cancer, and asthma in children. And that's not good from an economic point of view, because it's expensive to look after people who are ill. And so the government should be encouraging people to be as healthy as possible, because then they don't have to spend so much money on healthcare. And also people are much more productive if they are healthy. They're working, they're earning money, and they're spending money. And that's, from an economic point of view, that's what the government wants us to be doing. Earning money, spending money. And so the government should be trying to phase out polluting vehicles, phase out combustion engine vehicles, and introduce low emission vehicles, introduce electric vehicles. Another thing that I always encourage people to do is to try and use noun person. So avoid the informal you can do this, you can do that. Always tell us whom you're actually talking about. Are you talking about local residents? Are you talking about local inhabitants? Are you talking about commuters? Are you talking about passengers on a particular form of transportation? Are you talking about visitors to the city? Are you talking about tourists? So don't forget to use your noun person, particularly in part 1 and in part 3. And when you're recording vocabulary, don't forget your verb and noun collocation. And there's lots of verbs we can use with problem and issue. So identify, cause, face, confront, solve, resolve, overcome, remedy, overcome it. And then we've got other synonyms for problem and issue. So we might say challenges, obstacles, hurdles. So make sure, and I always say this, make sure you're recording your verb noun collocation together, because it's so useful, and you want them to fire up in your brain, you want them to fire up in your mind when you're speaking or writing quickly as a pair, not memorizing things separately. Try and understand how things are interconnected with each other. It's much better for your memory. And then just some other adjective noun collocation. So long-term plan, long-term objective, aim, goal, target. So for example, I could say, I think that a long-term plan of the government should be to encourage car owners to buy electric vehicles. A short-term measure is that the government should be encouraging people to cycle much more. And when we're talking about what the government should be doing, we might talk about policy, initiative, measure, strategy. And if we're talking about law, they actually introduce laws to make people do things. or to punish people for doing certain things which they don't want them to do, then we can also use the noun legislation. And the verbs there, introduce and implement. And then issues with living in a city, we've already mentioned. So poor air quality, health issues, particularly respiratory diseases like asthma and lung cancer. That's the other one. And overcrowding, overpopulation, traffic congestion, and increased stress and pressure on local services. And there's other things as well, which also relates to tourism. When a place becomes very popular and you get lots of people coming and they want to get things like accommodation, so rent accommodation, or they're buying things in that place, that will cause price inflation. If there's more demand for something, then people who have that, they can put the price up because they know people will be willing to pay for it. And so price inflation, particularly the increase in rents, the increase in rented accommodation, that's a big, big issue. And we're seeing protests in very popular tourist destinations at the moment, protesting against exactly this, that they can't afford, that local residents can no longer afford to live in the places where they were born and grew up because they become such popular tourist destinations. And the ones that have been in the news a lot are Barcelona, another Spanish, I think it's Mallorca, and then Venice in Italy. Because they become so popular, local residents can no longer afford to live there because there's such a demand for the accommodation. And we have that issue in the UK as well, in many places. Um, so it's a big, big issue, and the government must be implementing strategies to combat this. Otherwise, it's going to lead to other big problems. Other ones to mention are poverty, homelessness, drug addiction, and as we mentioned, an increase in the rate of crime, and also littering as well, particularly with tourism. Lots of people come, they throw rubbish on the floor. So what are some of the solutions for this? Things like impose a tax on petrol. So talking about trying to alleviate traffic congestion and improve air quality. So one measure that the government can introduce is to impose a tax on petrol, impose a road tax or a purchase tax on buying a internal combustion engine vehicle. And conversely, they can introduce subsidies. They can subsidize people who want to buy an electric vehicle, so they actually pay part of the price. The other thing that we've done in London is to set up low emission zones. So within the centre of London, if somebody wants to drive into that area, they actually have to pay a fee to enter this low emission zone. And they've been very, very popular, particularly with local residents, because they're the ones that have noticed the improvement in air quality, the reduction in noise pollution, and the safety, because there are less vehicles driving around very, very fast. So it's something that's been very, very popular with local inhabitants. And there are some other verb noun collocations that we've been mentioning as we've gone through. And there's some example general statements which we can go through in a lesson. So hopefully that's been useful, and I really strongly encourage you to memorize as much of this vocabulary to talk about this issue, because it's so good for urbanisation and tourism. Okay, I hope that helped.